He was a powerful millionaire CEO, untouchable in the boardroom, but broken at home. She was a 25-year-old woman struggling to keep her family afloat, with no idea her life was about to collide with his. When a blind date meant as a favor turned into a night of laughter, courage, and a child's fragile secret, their worlds began to unravel in ways neither of them could imagine. What started as chance became a battle for love, survival, and a truth that would shock an entire city. Ethan Ward had built his reputation on control. Every day of his 35 years, especially the last 10 as CEO of Ward Capital, had been carefully calculated. Sharp suits, precise schedules, decisions measured in billions. People around him whispered about his brilliance, his power, his ruthlessness, but they never whispered about his loneliness. Since his wife had left 3 years ago, leaving him with their 2-year-old daughter, he had thrown himself into his empire as if money could fill the silence in his house. Yet nothing replaced the sound of a child's laugh echoing in rooms where he spent too little time. It was his oldest friend, Marcus Hale, who broke through the iron routine. Marcus had known Ethan before the suits and the money, back when they were two kids dreaming of better lives. He was the only one who could sit across from Ethan and roll his eyes at the billionaire mask. One rainy Friday, Marcus pushed a card across the bar where they were meeting. "You owe me, Ward. One favor. A blind date. You promised years ago you'd try it once." Ethan scoffed, swirling his glass. "I don't have time to be a punchline in some matchmaking scheme." Marcus smirked. "Then make time. You need something real before you turn into one of your own spreadsheets. It's dinner, not a marriage proposal." That's how Ethan, against his better judgment, found himself walking into a small Italian bistro in a quiet corner of Nashville. It was nothing like the high-end places he usually frequented for business dinners. The room smelled of garlic and basil, the brick walls decorated with mismatched art. A string of small lights hung across the ceiling, casting a golden warmth that felt almost foreign to him. He glanced at his watch. He was early, of course. Punctuality was a rule he never broke. She was late by 10 minutes. He noticed her before she saw him, the way the door swung open and she stepped in, shaking the rain from her hair. She wore a worn coat, sneakers that had seen better days, and carried herself with the quick, alert energy of someone used to long shifts. Her hair was damp, falling around her face in loose strands, and her eyes, wide, brown, curious, scanned the room before settling on him. "Ava," she said, approaching the table with a small, apologetic smile. "Sorry, my shift ran over. I hope you weren't waiting long." "Ethan," he replied, standing out of habit to greet her. "And no, you're right on time." He gestured to the seat across from him, and she slipped into it, brushing rain from her sleeve. He expected the usual awkward small talk, the exchange of pleasantries. Instead, she surprised him immediately by ordering hot water with lemon instead of wine. "I think I'm catching a cold," she admitted with a shrug. Then instead of asking what he did for a living, the question he always dreaded, the one that turned evenings into interviews, she began describing the way the rain smelled different depending on where you stood in the city. Near the clinic, it smells sharp, antiseptic, almost metallic. But here it's like wet wood and warm bread. Her words were simple, but her perspective was vivid, alive. Ethan found himself listening as though she were showing him a city he had lived in for years, but never really noticed. Their food arrived, and the conversation drifted into unexpected places. Childhood fears, books they loved, the strange ways people showed affection without saying it out loud. Ethan realized he was telling her things he hadn't shared in years. About Lily, his daughter, who loved to cover his laptop with stickers. About how empty the penthouse felt without her laughter when she was with the nanny. About his wife, who had walked out without looking back. Ava didn't interrupt, didn't pity him. She simply listened, her expression open and steady, as though she understood that silence could be the greatest kindness. Then chaos struck the restaurant. A child in the far corner began choking on a piece of pasta. The mother froze, panic overtaking her face as the boy gasped for air. Before Ethan even processed what was happening, Ava was out of her seat. She moved quickly, confidently, standing behind the boy and performing the Heimlich maneuver with steady, practiced hands. After a few tense seconds, the boy coughed, and the lodge food flew free. The boy burst into tears, and the entire restaurant erupted in applause. Ava returned to the table, brushing her hair back from her flushed face. Ethan stared at her, not with the admiration the rest of the room was giving, but with something deeper. "Are you a medic?" he asked. "Almost," she said with a small laugh. "I was studying nursing, had to pause because of money. For now I work two jobs, coffee shop and clinic reception. But I like feeling useful." Ethan nodded, feeling something stir in him that he couldn't name. He had spent years surrounded by people who measured their worth in numbers and deals. Here was someone who measured hers in the ability to save a stranger's child. When they finished dinner, the rain was still falling. He offered to call her a car, but she shook her head, tugging up her hood. "I live 3 blocks away, and thank you for tonight." My head felt quiet for a while. "That's rare." "For me, too," Ethan admitted, surprising himself with how much he meant it. He watched her walk away into the rain, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the city was made of glass and numbers. For the first time in years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was something real waiting outside the walls he had built around himself. That night, he left his phone untouched until morning. The days that followed their first dinner unfolded in a way Ethan had not expected. Normally, when people discovered who he was, conversations shifted almost immediately into a kind of cautious formality, every word measured, every question laced with curiosity about his wealth or his company. But with Ava, it was different. She didn't know, or maybe she didn't care. Either way, it allowed him to exist in a rare, precious space of anonymity. He found himself picking up his phone in quiet moments, not to check market reports or board updates, but to see if she had messaged. Their exchanges weren't the polished, empty kind he was used to from business dinners or half-hearted dates. They were alive, peculiar, filled with small snapshots of her world. One morning she sent him a photo of dawn breaking over the parking lot of the clinic, streaks of pink and gray stretching over rows of rusted cars. Later that week, she recorded the sound of rain pattering on the tin roof of the coffee shop where she worked. In return, Ethan sent her things he had never thought to share with anyone before. A voice note of Lily's laughter as she declared that their cardboard box rocket had successfully landed on Mars, a blurry picture of her covered in flour after trying to help him bake pancakes. Ava responded with delight, not performative politeness, and her warmth drew him closer. By their second meeting, circumstances forced him to bring Lily along. His nanny had fallen ill at the last minute, and for a moment Ethan almost canceled. But something in him resisted. He didn't want to lose the fragile thread of connection that had begun to weave between them. When Ava arrived and saw the little girl clutching her father's hand, she didn't hesitate or retreat. She crouched to Lily's level, smiled, and asked if she could sit on the floor beside her. Then with practiced fingers, she folded a napkin into the shape of a butterfly and handed it to the child. Lily's face lit up, and soon she was giggling as Ava showed her how to make more. Ethan sat back, watching the scene with an odd mix of wonder and something dangerously close to longing. Ava wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't putting on a show. She simply connected in a way that felt effortless and natural. Lily, who could be shy around strangers, leaned into her almost instantly. It was the first time Ethan had seen his daughter engage with someone outside of family and school without hesitation. When Lily ran off to the counter to watch the barista froth milk, Ethan leaned closer to Ava. "You're some kind of magician," he said, half teasing, half serious. "I'm not magic," she replied with a soft smile. "I just remember what it's like to be small." The words hit him in a place he didn't expect. He had spent so long trying to give Lily everything. Yet he often worried he had given her too little of himself. Work pulled him away constantly. Guilt followed him like a shadow. Watching Ava with his daughter made that guilt sharper, but it also gave him a strange, aching hope. Maybe someone like Ava could see things he could not. The evening passed quickly, filled with stories that ranged from silly to deeply personal. Ava shared pieces of her life that were heavy, though she carried them lightly. She spoke of her younger sister, June, only 12, who still needed help with homework and bedtime routines. She spoke of her mother, whose health had been fragile since surgery, and how Ava often worked double shifts just to cover the bills. Ethan realized she lived in a world very different from his own. Not of excess, but of stretching every dollar until it almost tore. And yet she spoke of it without bitterness, only determination. For his part, Ethan revealed more of himself than he had planned. Not the CEO, not the empire, but the man who sometimes forgot what it was like to laugh freely, who worried about raising a little girl without her mother, who often felt like the wealth around him was a fortress and a prison at the same time. Ava didn't flinch at his confessions. She didn't try to solve them or offer empty platitudes. She simply listened, her gaze steady, as though hearing him was enough. When the evening ended, Lily clutched her paper butterfly all the way home. She refused to let go of it, falling asleep with it in her small hand. Ethan stood in the doorway of her room, watching her breathe softly, the fragile napkin butterfly resting on her chest. His heart swelled with something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, or the dangerous flicker of wanting more than just an evening here and there with Ava. Later that night, his phone buzzed. A simple message from Ava. "Tell Lily I'll teach her how to make a whole flock of butterflies next time." Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the screen, a rare smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in a long time, he let himself imagine that next time wasn't just a polite phrase, it was a promise. The third chapter of their story began like a slow, creeping storm that neither of them saw coming. For weeks, Ethan had lived in a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. Days filled with board meetings and negotiations, nights punctuated by stolen hours with Ava, quick coffees, quiet dinners, text messages that made him smile at times when he normally felt nothing but exhaustion. He had kept his secret intact, careful not to reveal the full truth of who he was. Part of him told himself it was protection, protection for Ava, who deserved peace from the flashing cameras and invasive headlines, and protection for himself, because if she knew he was a multimillionaire CEO, maybe she would see him differently. But secrets have a way of cracking open, and Ethan's did in the most public way possible. It started with a photograph. A passerby in a cafe snapped a picture of Ethan and Ava sitting together, Lily between them, her small hand wrapped around Ava's. The image wasn't posed, wasn't staged. It was simply a snapshot of three people sharing a laugh over hot chocolate and napkin butterflies. But in the age of instant news, that single photo traveled like fire. By morning, it was splashed across gossip sites with the headline, "Billionaire CEO Ethan Ward spotted with mystery woman and child." The speculation was merciless. Who was she? Was this a scandal? A fling? A secret second family? By the time Ethan arrived at his office, his assistant was already pale with panic, and his PR director had a thick file waiting. "We need to control the narrative immediately," she said briskly, sliding a folder across his desk. "Here are drafts of official statements. Here's a non-disclosure agreement template for her. We can spin this as casual, temporary, something harmless." Ethan stopped her with a sharp look. "She's not a liability. She's not a narrative. She's a person." But the pressure didn't end there. By noon, members of the board had called an emergency meeting. Around the long mahogany table, voices were sharp and cold. "We cannot afford distractions," one executive insisted. "Ward capital depends on stability. Investors spook easily, and headlines like this raise questions about your judgment." Another chimed in, "If she's from a lower background, the press will tear her apart. You need to act fast. Distance yourself." Ethan sat in silence, his jaw tight, his hands folded on the table. He had faced billion-dollar crises, hostile takeovers, regulatory battles, but none of them had churned his gut like this. The idea of Ava being dissected, mocked, her life torn open by vultures who didn't know her, it filled him with a rage he fought to keep hidden. And then came the final blow, a letter from his late wife's parents, delivered through their lawyer. They were petitioning the court to revisit custody of Lily. Their reasoning was clear and cruel. "Mr. Ward's judgment is compromised. He exposes the child to unsafe environments and questionable influences." The implication was obvious. Ava, by being near him, was now a target, and they were using her existence as a weapon to pry Lily away. That night, Ethan drove to the clinic where Ava worked, waiting outside near the staff entrance. When she appeared, tired and weighed down after a long shift, she froze at the sight of him. He looked raw, the calm CEO mask nowhere to be seen. "You've seen it," he said quietly. "I've seen it," Ava answered, her voice edged with exhaustion and hurt. "They've turned my life upside down. Reporters outside the coffee shop, neighbors whispering. My sister's scared. My mom's asking questions I don't know how to answer. You should have told me who you were." Ethan swallowed hard. I didn't tell you because I wanted something real. I didn't want money or headlines between us. I wanted you to see me, not the CEO. And now, she asked bitterly? Now the whole world sees me as the CEO's new scandal. I don't belong in that world, Ethan. I can't survive in it. I have people who depend on me, and I can't protect them from this. Her words cut deeper than anything the board or the lawyers had said. For a moment, he had no defense. Only truth remained. I don't want this to end, he admitted, his voice low, unguarded. I don't know how to fix it, but I can't lose this. Not you, not what we have. Ava's eyes softened, but only slightly. She wrapped her arms around herself as if bracing against a storm. I can't promise you anything, Ethan, except one thing. No more lies. If there's even a chance this continues, we have to tell the truth. Always. Even when it hurts. He nodded slowly, the weight of the promise sinking into his chest. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't safety. But it was a fragile thread tying them together in the middle of chaos. As she walked away into the night, Ethan leaned against his car, staring after her, feeling more exposed than he had in years. For the first time, the fortress of his wealth and power felt less like armor and more like glass. Thin, fragile, ready to shatter. And he knew with a clarity that chilled him that the storm had only just begun. It happened so suddenly that Ethan never had time to prepare. One afternoon, when the late summer sun hung heavy over the city, Lily was in the garden of his penthouse building. She had been drawing with chalk on the stone path, her little hands covered in streaks of blue and yellow. At first it seemed like fatigue when she slumped against the bench. But then Ethan noticed the bruises on her arms. They were scattered, dark and uneven, and he knew she hadn't fallen or bumped herself. His chest tightened with dread. Before he could call her name again, she crumpled to the ground. The ambulance ride blurred in his memory. Flashing lights, a paramedic's calm but clipped instructions, Lily's small figure lying too still on the stretcher. He sat frozen, unable to reach her, only clutching the side rail until his knuckles went white. By the time they arrived at the hospital, every fiber of his being screamed at him to fix it. But this was not a boardroom, and there were no contracts to negotiate here. The doctor's words carved themselves into Ethan's mind with merciless clarity. Aplastic anemia. Her bone marrow isn't producing enough blood cells. It's severe. She'll need transfusions, and ultimately, a bone marrow transplant. Without it, the outlook is poor. Ethan heard the rest, risks, percentages, potential outcomes, but it was as though someone had submerged him underwater. All he could focus on was the way his daughter's pale face looked against the stark white pillow. He tried to stay strong for her. He held her hand as she lay in the bed with tubes snaking from her arms, his voice steady as he read stories aloud. But at night, when the room was quiet and Lily finally drifted into fragile sleep, Ethan's mask cracked. He sat in the hospital chair, staring at her, feeling utterly powerless. For a man who could buy solutions to almost any problem, this was the first time his wealth meant nothing. He would have given it all, every dollar, every title, if it meant Lily could wake up healthy again. Ava came quietly into the room that first night. She didn't say anything at first. She simply moved to Lily's bedside and began reading from The Little Prince, her voice soft and melodic. Lily stirred, opened her eyes slightly and whispered, "Butterfly? Make me another butterfly." Ethan's heart twisted, watching Ava fold a scrap of paper into delicate wings, handing it gently into the girl's small hands. For the first time that day, Lily smiled. Later, when Ethan stepped into the hallway to speak to the doctors, he found Ava there, her expression serious but unwavering. "What can I do?" she asked. He shook his head helplessly. "There's nothing. They need a donor. Family is the first option, but I don't match her. Neither do my parents. The registry is our only hope." "Then I'll join," Ava said firmly, without hesitation. "Put me in the registry, tonight." Ethan stared at her, startled. "Ava, you don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted. "If there's even a chance I could help, I want to try. Don't argue with me." Her voice held such conviction that Ethan couldn't. The next morning she was tested, her blood drawn, her information logged. He didn't dare hope, didn't dare let his heart believe that this woman who had walked into his life by chance could also be the one to save his daughter. He had already learned the cost of hope when it was ripped away. But 2 days later, the coordinator returned with news that made Ethan's knees nearly buckle. "We found a match," she said. "Not perfect, but extremely rare. High compatibility. We need to move quickly." She gave him no details of the donor's identity. Protocol demanded anonymity. But Ethan clung to those words as if they were oxygen. High compatibility. That night, Ethan sat in the dark hospital room, watching Lily sleep, her chest rising and falling beneath a thin blanket. He whispered to her, though she couldn't hear, "Hold on, sweetheart. Someone out there is going to help us. Just hold on." Behind him, Ava stood silently at the door, unseen, her own arms sore from where they had drawn her blood. She didn't tell him the results had come back. She didn't tell him that she was the match. She only watched him as he clutched his daughter's hand, his face breaking in the shadows, and felt a weight settle into her heart. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was hers too. The day of the transplant arrived with a heaviness that pressed down on everyone. Ethan woke before dawn, though he hadn't really slept. The sterile smell of the hospital corridors had become too familiar, seeping into his clothes and his skin. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting Lily's IV lines, preparing her for the long hours ahead. Ethan sat in the chair by her bed, holding her small hand as though by sheer force of will he could keep her tethered to him. Her skin felt fragile, her body too light beneath the blankets, and yet when she opened her eyes, she gave him a weak smile that gutted him completely. "Daddy," she whispered, "don't look so worried. I'll be okay. You told me butterflies always find their way back, remember?" Ethan swallowed hard, fighting to keep his composure, and kissed her forehead. Somewhere else in the hospital, in another ward hidden from his view, Ava was being prepped. She lay on a bed in a gown, her arm marked for IV access, her body tense but resolute. No one knew what she carried inside her chest, the storm of fear and determination. She had signed the paperwork without hesitation, though the list of possible complications was long. Pain, infection, even long-term risks. But none of that mattered. In her mind, all she could see was Lily's face, that little girl clutching the paper butterfly she had folded, asking for just one more. Ava whispered to herself, "If I can give her a chance, then it's worth everything." Ethan wasn't allowed to know who the donor was. He wasn't allowed to thank them. The coordinator repeated the rules with firm detachment. Anonymity, no contact, no personal details. All Ethan could do was write a short note of gratitude on a plain piece of paper, one he wasn't even sure the donor would ever see. His handwriting was shaky, betraying the exhaustion of sleepless nights. "You don't know what you've done for us, but I will never forget it. My daughter's life is my world, and you are giving her a future. Thank you, from the depths of a father's heart." He folded the note carefully and handed it to the nurse, his throat tight as though the words had carved their way out of him. Hours stretched endlessly. Ethan paced the corridors, his expensive shoes clicking softly against the tiles, though he barely noticed. The usual confidence he carried into boardrooms and negotiations was gone. He felt stripped bare, reduced to nothing but a father praying for his little girl's survival. Every time a nurse emerged from behind the operating room doors, his chest clenched, but none of them brought the news he was desperate to hear. He tried reading to distract himself, tried calling Marcus, even stared at spreadsheets on his tablet. But nothing could pull his mind from the image of Lily lying in that room, her life dependent on a stranger's marrow. When the surgery was finally complete, the doctor emerged, fatigue in his eyes but calm assurance in his voice. "The procedure went well. It's too early to say more, but she's stable. The next days will be critical." Ethan closed his eyes and exhaled, his body sagging with relief. He wanted to ask about the donor, about how they had fared, but he caught himself. The rules. Always the rules. Still, he couldn't help it. "And the donor?" he asked quietly. The doctor hesitated, then said, "There were some complications during collection. Nothing we couldn't manage. They're recovering." His voice was professional, but there was a flicker of admiration there, as though the donor had shown unusual courage. Ethan nodded, though his mind raced. Who was this person willing to endure pain for a child they didn't know? What kind of heart made that choice? He had spent his life surrounded by people chasing profit, leverage, and control. Yet somewhere in this same building was someone who had given more than money ever could. That night, Ethan sat by Lily's bedside again, watching the rise and fall of her chest. The machines hummed softly, a rhythm that became his anchor. A nurse slipped in quietly and left a drawing on the nightstand. It was a butterfly, bright red and lopsided, drawn in crayon with clumsy strokes. Beneath it, in a child's scrawl, were the words, "Thank you, invisible fairy." Ethan's throat closed, and for the first time in years, he let himself cry openly, silent tears falling onto his hands as he held his daughters. He didn't know that just a few doors away, Ava lay recovering, her body weak, her arm bruised, her energy drained. She turned her head toward the wall and closed her eyes, thinking not of the pain, but of the little girl who now had a chance. She whispered into the dark, "Fly, little butterfly, fly back home." And though Ethan could not hear her, her words seemed to settle into the air around him, giving him the faint, unshakable sense that they were not alone in this fight. 2 days passed in a blur of exhaustion and fragile hope. Lily was stable, but every doctor's word reminded Ethan that stability was not yet victory. The transplant had gone well, yes, but the real battle was only beginning. The next weeks would decide whether her tiny body accepted the new marrow, whether her immune system rebuilt itself. Ethan clung to her bedside like a sentinel, afraid that if he stepped away even for a moment, something terrible would happen. He read stories to her when she was awake, watched her chest rise and fall when she slept, and whispered promises into the sterile air that he would never leave, that she would have her whole future ahead of her, that she would grow strong enough to run through gardens again. On the third evening, just as exhaustion was pulling at his eyelids, Ava walked into the room. She looked different, paler, thinner, moving more slowly than before. She wore a loose hoodie that swallowed her frame, her sleeves pulled low. For a moment, Ethan felt relief simply seeing her, as though her presence steadied him in the chaos. But then he noticed the faint stiffness in her walk, the careful way she lowered herself into the chair, and a small square of medical tape visible at her wrist. He frowned. "Where have you been?" The question came out harsher than he intended. Ava lowered her eyes, folding her hands in her lap. "I was in the hospital," she admitted quietly. "After a procedure. There were some complications. I needed time to recover." Something in Ethan's chest twisted. "Ava, why didn't you tell me? I thought—" He cut himself off because the truth was, he hadn't known what to think. He had imagined her overwhelmed by the media frenzy, retreating from his life. He had told himself she needed space, but seeing her here, fragile and marked by fresh bandages, shook him. Before he could press further, the transplant coordinator entered the room. She glanced at Ava, paused, and her expression shifted in a way that made Ethan's heart pound. After a moment of hesitation, she spoke carefully. "Mr. Ward, normally I am bound by strict confidentiality. Donor identities are not disclosed, not until much later, and only under special circumstances. But sometimes, when both parties agree, anonymity can be lifted early." She turned her gaze to Ava. Ethan's breath caught. He looked at her, the truth already dawning on him. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." Ava's lips trembled, but she lifted her chin and nodded. "I was the match," she said. "It was me. That's why I disappeared. They needed the marrow quickly. I couldn't risk telling you until it was done." For a moment, Ethan could only stare at her, his mind struggling to process what she had just revealed. The world seemed to narrow until all he could see was her face, pale and tired, but steady with quiet courage. "You," he said again, his voice breaking. "You did this for Lily." "I just matched," Ava replied softly, trying to downplay it, though her eyes glistened. "Anyone in my position would have done the same." "No," Ethan said firmly, his voice rough with emotion. He stepped closer, fighting the urge to take her in his arms right there. "Not anyone. Donating marrow isn't simple. It isn't painless. You risked yourself, Ava. You gave her a chance at life. Do you understand what that means? You didn't just help. You saved her." Ava looked away, her fingers twisting together. "I didn't want you to feel indebted. I didn't want this to change things between us. I did it for her, because she deserves a future. And because—" her voice faltered, but she forced herself to continue. "Because you deserve to see her grow up." Ethan's throat tightened until it hurt. He reached out, hesitated, and then gently took her hand in his. Her skin was cool, her fingers trembling faintly from weakness, but the connection between them was electric. "Ava," he said, his voice low, raw, "there is no way this doesn't change everything. You've already changed everything. For me, for Lily, for us." For the first time in years, tears burned at the edges of his eyes, but he didn't care. He let them fall, standing there with her hand in his, with his daughter sleeping between them, alive because of the impossible grace of this woman. The moment didn't feel like an ending, or even a beginning. It felt like a revelation, as though some invisible door had opened and none of their lives would ever be the same again. And in that silence, with machines humming gently and Lily breathing peacefully, Ethan realized something profound. All his wealth, all his power, all the control he had ever clung to, none of it had saved his child. But Ava had. And in doing so, she had shattered the fortress he had built around his heart, leaving behind something he had long forgotten he was capable of: hope. The revelation of Ava's sacrifice didn't remain hidden for long. Hospitals, even the best of them, had leaks, and soon the story began to ripple outward. A reporter caught wind that the anonymous donor who had saved the billionaire CEO's daughter wasn't some distant stranger, but someone shockingly close. By the time it reached the press, the headlines spun themselves into dramatic tales. Millionaire CEO's secret angel who saved Lily Ward. In love, loyalty, and bone marrow, the untold story. Ethan's world, already fragile, was thrust under. Another spotlight, but this time the narrative was different. It wasn't scandal and suspicion, it was awe. Ethan knew the attention would come, but he wanted to control it. When his board of directors called yet another emergency meeting, urging him to release a carefully sanitized statement, he refused. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice hard with conviction. "This is about the thousands of children like Lily who don't have a match, who are waiting for a chance. This is about people like Ava who are brave enough to step forward." They pressed him, reminding him of stockholder confidence and market optics. Ethan didn't flinch. For once, he didn't care about the numbers. Instead, he called a press conference on his own terms. Standing before a room packed with flashing cameras and restless reporters, Ethan shed the polished armor of the CEO and spoke as a father. His suit was simple, his tone quiet but steady. "You've written your stories about me," he began, eyes scanning the crowd. "But this isn't about business or wealth or headlines. This is about my daughter, Lily, who is alive today because someone chose courage over comfort. This is about donors, people who give of themselves so that strangers may live. We don't celebrate them enough. We don't make it easy for them. That changes now." He went on to announce the creation of the Lily Ward Foundation, pledging millions to cover medical expenses for donors, to fund awareness campaigns, and to establish paid leave programs within his own company for anyone willing to donate marrow or blood. He outlined partnerships with hospitals and research centers, determined to transform a private miracle into a public movement. The press, expecting a billionaire's slick sound bites, instead heard the raw voice of a father who had nearly lost everything. It stunned them into silence before the questions came, rapid and insistent. But for once, Ethan didn't feel like he was on trial. He felt like he was finally telling the truth. Ava, meanwhile, remained in the background. She hadn't wanted recognition. In fact, she begged Ethan not to mention her name, to keep her role hidden. She didn't want to be paraded as a symbol, didn't want strangers digging through her already fragile life. But there came a moment she couldn't avoid. When Ethan introduced the foundation to his company employees, the staff stood in quiet expectation. He asked Ava gently if she would say something. Reluctantly, she stepped up to the small podium, her hands trembling. She said only a few words, her voice soft but clear. "Being afraid is normal, but doing nothing is worse. Sometimes we get the chance to save someone, and when that happens, you don't think, you just do it." Her speech lasted less than a minute, but when she stepped down, the room erupted in applause. The ripple effect of her choice spread further than either of them could have imagined. Donation sign-ups spiked across the city. Volunteers filled clinics to register. For every critic who whispered that Ava had overstepped, 100 more praised her courage. And amidst the chaos, another quiet victory arrived. Ethan received word that his late wife's parents, the ones who had filed for custody, had withdrawn their petition. They had seen Lily in the hospital, recovering, color returning to her cheeks. They had seen Ava at her bedside, patient and gentle, reading stories while Ethan caught moments of rest. When they visited again, standing awkwardly in the doorway, the grandmother had whispered, "She looks safe. She looks loved." The grandfather, a stern man who rarely showed softness, extended his hand to Ethan. "Take care of her," he said simply. "You're doing right by her." That night, Ethan returned to Lily's room with tears burning behind his eyes. Ava sat by the bed, brushing strands of hair from the girl's forehead as she slept. He watched them, his heart heavy with gratitude and something deeper he couldn't ignore anymore. Ava had given him more than he could ever repay. Not just Lily's second chance, but the strength to face the world as a man, not just a CEO. And yet, as he stood there, he knew the battle wasn't over. There would still be complications, still nights of fear, still tests and treatments. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt he wasn't carrying it alone. He wasn't standing at the edge of a cliff by himself. Ava had stepped beside him, and together they had turned despair into something unshakable. The storm had not passed completely, but in its heart, something new had taken root. Resilience, hope, and a bond strong enough to weather whatever came next. The weeks that followed felt like the slow emergence of dawn after a long and merciless night. Lily was discharged from the hospital at last, her cheeks touched with the first real color Ethan had seen in months. The day they brought her home, she insisted on carrying her bag herself, a small but symbolic gesture of independence. Ethan held back tears as he watched her walk through the doors of the penthouse, her little hand brushing against the walls as though she was rediscovering her home. He knew there would still be hurdles, endless checkups, medications, precautions against infection, but in that moment, it felt like victory. They celebrated quietly. No champagne, no glittering parties. Instead, Ethan, Ava, and Lily sat cross-legged on the living room floor, eating pizza from paper plates, while Lily showed Ava the butterfly fort she had made from pillows and blankets. Ethan sat back, watching them, realizing with almost painful clarity that this, laughter, crumbs on the carpet, Ava's hair falling loose from its tie as she leaned in to listen to Lily, was the kind of wealth he had never known he needed. But it wasn't easy. Nights were still long and often heavy with fear. There were times when Lily's fever spiked and panic threatened to drown him. Times when exhaustion left him sharp and restless, snapping at small things. He would catch Ava's gaze then, steady and patient, and it was enough to bring him back. She never pretended the road was easy. She never offered false hope. She simply stayed, her presence quiet but constant, the anchor that kept him from collapsing under the weight of uncertainty. As autumn turned to winter, Ethan began to notice changes not just in himself, but in Ava. For years, her life had been defined by sacrifice. Double shifts, endless bills, responsibilities too heavy for her young shoulders. But now, with the help of the Lily Ward Foundation, she returned to school, her tuition covered. In the evenings, she still came to their home, helping Lily with crafts, cooking simple meals, and sometimes just sitting with Ethan in the quiet after Lily had gone to bed. They didn't need grand declarations. The bond between them had been forged in something stronger than romance. Shared pain, shared responsibility, shared love for a little girl who had given them both a reason to fight. One evening close to Christmas, Ethan surprised Ava with a small box. They were in the kitchen, the air filled with the smell of cinnamon and oranges, while Lily built yet another fortress out of blankets and cushions. When Ava opened the box, she found a delicate silver pendant shaped like a butterfly. For a moment, she said nothing, only traced the outline with her fingers, her eyes shining. "It isn't much," Ethan said softly, "not compared to what you've given me. But it's a reminder of the night you sat with her in folded paper wings, of the day you saved her, of the way you saved me too." Ava looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Once I thought your life was untouchable, like something behind glass. But now, it feels like a home, and somehow, I'm part of it." Ethan reached for her hand. "Home is you two, always." From the other room, Lily's small voice called out, "And where's my room in this home?" Ethan smiled, his throat tightening with emotion. He turned toward her fortress, where she peeked out with wide eyes. "Wherever the biggest windows are," he said, "so the butterflies always know how to find their way back to you." Lily giggled and disappeared into the pillows again, her laughter echoing through the apartment. Ava leaned against Ethan, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself exhale completely. Not as a CEO, not as a man carrying a world of burdens, but simply as a father and a man who had found love in the most unexpected place. The road ahead was still uncertain. There would be scars, both visible and hidden. But in that moment, under the glow of soft kitchen lights and the sound of a child's laughter, Ethan knew they had built something unshakable. It wasn't built of money or power or control. It was built of sacrifice, of courage, of small acts of love that had piled up until they created something stronger than any empire. And as he stood there holding Ava's hand and listening to Lily's joy, Ethan realized the truth. This wasn't the ending of their story at all. It was the beginning of everything they had been fighting for. A life not perfect, not easy, but real. A life where butterflies, once fragile, could finally take flight. For me, the conclusion of Ethan and Ava's journey is not simply a happy ending. It's a story about transformation. Ethan, a man who built his life on control, numbers, and the illusion of invulnerability, discovered that true strength was not in his wealth or status, but in vulnerability and love. Ava, who carried the weight of sacrifice and survival, found that her courage could not only save lives, but also build a family where she finally belonged. And Lily, the innocent thread that tied them together, became both the reason and the proof that love can heal wounds no amount of money ever could. The beauty of this ending lies in how ordinary acts, folding paper butterflies, sitting by a hospital bed, whispering words of encouragement, became extraordinary when combined with loyalty, sacrifice, and trust. The shock of the story is not in the dramatic twists, but in how two people from completely different worlds prove that home is not built from glass towers or fortunes, but from the courage to let someone in. I see this finale as a reminder. Sometimes life shakes us to our core, not to break us, but to rearrange us into who we were meant to be. And in that sense, Ethan, Ava, and Lily didn't just survive their trials, they created a beginning worth more than any empire.